My name is Leora Manaz, and what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible. I know that. I wouldn't have believed it either until it happened to me. I was born in Shiraz, Iran, into one of the last Jewish families that still remained there. My father, Yaakov, was a stern man, a scholar, but a survivor. My mother, Miriam, was softer, more quiet, and always humming the psalms beneath her breath when no one was listening. Life wasn't easy. It never is when your faith doesn't match your surroundings. But we learned to keep our heads down, speak carefully, and move through life like shadows in a place that was never truly home. I was 35 when it happened. A normal woman, a school teacher, unmarried, and trying to hold on to my traditions in a city that felt more and more like it was waiting to erupt. That day, I remember waking with a strange sense of unease. The air itself felt wrong, thick, heavy, as if something ancient was pressing down on the rooftops. I had just stepped into the courtyard to hang laundry when I felt it, like a fire igniting in my chest. A sharp, tearing pain shot down my left arm, and before I could scream, the sky above me collapsed into blackness. My body hit the stone floor, and everything went still. I was dead, or at least that's what I learned later. But what I felt in that moment was not death, it was silence. The world around me faded, but I became aware of something deeper. I was still me. I could feel my thoughts, feel my emotions, but I was no longer inside my body. I watched it. I saw my mother kneeling beside me, screaming my name in a voice I had never heard from her before. Her tears landed on my lifeless face, and yet I couldn't touch her, couldn't speak. I hovered above it all, an observer to my own ending. I remember thinking, this is what it feels like to be forgotten. But then something shifted. The silence turned into sound, a low hum, vibrating like music that had no melody, only power. I was being pulled, gently but firmly, through a place that wasn't quite sky, wasn't quite dream. I drifted through colors I've never seen before, hues that don't exist in this world. There was no tunnel, not for me. It was more like being carried through the folds of something alive, something infinite. And then he appeared. I didn't know what I was looking at first. A figure standing in the distance, cloaked in radiant light, not the kind that burns, but the kind that reveals. I felt every hidden thought inside me brought to the surface in an instant. I felt known, exposed, and yet loved in a way I had never known. He stepped forward, and without a single word, I knew who he was. Yeshua, I whispered, barely able to believe my own voice. I had heard his name before, only in secret, whispered among persecuted believers, dismissed as myth by others. But now I stood before him. Jesus. He didn't need to introduce himself. His presence was enough. His eyes, if I can even call them that, looked into me, beyond me, through every layer of who I had become. And what I saw reflected back wasn't judgment. It was sadness. He spoke to me, but not with lips. His voice rang through the space like thunder wrapped in compassion. Leora, he said, you must return. No, I said without hesitation. Please, not there. Not again. Let me stay here. But he shook his head slowly, and what he said next sent a chill deeper than the grave. You must warn them. Tell them what is coming. Tell them what I showed you. The time is near. I wanted to ask so many questions, but suddenly the beauty around me dimmed, not out of malice, but out of necessity. He touched me, and in that touch came a torrent of visions, searing, horrifying visions that would change everything I believed about the world, about God, and about the future. The next thing I remember was an impossible stillness. It was as if I'd been pulled out of time itself, no sound, no light, no weight, just awareness. I hovered above my body, which lay motionless on the cold marble floor of my penthouse. Paramedics had arrived. One was performing CPR with desperate precision, while another read vitals aloud. Yet their voices were muted, like an underwater echo. I wasn't scared. Oddly, I felt serene, detached. Then came the shift. From the silence emerged a warmth, not heat, but a deep, radiant presence. I was drawn upward, as if gravity reversed. There was no ceiling, no sky, just rising. And then light, brilliant, but not blinding. It was alive. It wasn't like staring at the sun. It was like being embraced by purity itself. And from within that light, I felt the presence. And then I saw him, Jesus. I can't describe his face with earthly detail. It was too beautiful, too holy. But I knew it was him. The scars in his hands radiated light, not wounds but windows of love. His eyes, oh God, his eyes. They didn't judge me. They saw me, every part of me, every lie I'd ever told, every backroom deal, every time I silenced my conscience for a contract. He saw it all, and still, he loved me. He didn't speak at first, but everything about him communicated directly into my soul. His presence was the language. I felt laid bare, stripped of the suits, the penthouses, the accolades. And I wept, not from fear, but from a crushing realization I had wasted my life. Finally, he spoke. The voice of Jesus didn't echo. It resonated. "Jonathan," he said, "what does it profit a man to gain the world and lose his soul?" I collapsed before him, though my body was no longer flesh. Shame coursed through me like ice. I tried to respond, but I couldn't form words. Then he lifted me, not with hands, but with mercy. And suddenly we were standing, though there was no ground, before a vast expanse, like a theater of the soul. And there, projected before us, were scenes from my life. The first was my 33rd birthday. My daughter, Amelia, had waited all night for me to come home. She'd drawn me a picture, stayed up in her pajamas, and fell asleep on the couch, marker in hand. I never came. I was at a gala in Milan, closing a merger that would boost my holdings by $90 million. I told myself I was doing it for her future. Jesus turned to me. "She didn't need your empire," he said softly. "She needed your presence." Next came a memory I had long buried. A former employee, Andre. He came to me during the 2008 crash, asking not for a bailout, but for a delay, time to pay back a loan I'd given under predatory terms. He was desperate, humiliated. He had 3 children. I sued him. I crushed him. His family lost everything. "Jonathan," Jesus said again, "you didn't just cost him his home. You wounded a soul made in my image." The memories kept coming. Dozens. Hundreds. Every lie. every affair, every time I traded love for leverage, compassion for control. I broke. Completely. I sobbed uncontrollably. Not because I feared punishment, but because I had lived a life so painfully empty, so grotesquely centered on me. I was a billionaire, and yet I had lived like a pauper in the things that mattered most. Then Jesus showed me something unexpected. He pointed to moments I had long forgotten, times I had said something kind to a stranger, the small donations I made without PR in mind, the day I helped an elderly man cross the street when I was still a broken turn. They were small, almost laughable, but in his eyes, they mattered. These were moments of light, he said, glimpses of who you were created to be. I looked up at him. Why are you showing me this? I deserve judgment. His face didn't flinch. You were never meant for judgment, Jonathan. But you chose it, by choosing self over love, greed over grace. And still I offer you mercy. Will you receive it? I didn't answer with words. I fell again, but this time, not from shame, from awe. He didn't force me. He invited me, and something in me broke open. I whispered, yes. What happened next changed me forever. Suddenly, the scenes shifted. I saw the world through his eyes. I saw people not as tools, not as threats, but as souls, eternal, radiant, sacred. I saw the chains money had put on me. I saw the prison I called a penthouse, and I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood. Freedom. When I opened my eyes again, I was back on the floor of my penthouse. The EMT above me gasped. "He's breathing!" someone yelled. But I wasn't the same. Everything had changed. I don't know how long I stood there in the light with him, but I remember that time no longer felt linear. Moments folded into each other, and everything felt eternal. Jesus stood with me, silent for a while, as if allowing the weight of what I'd just seen to settle in my soul. He didn't need to say a word. I already knew that my life, as I had lived it, was in ruins, even if the world had seen it as success. Then he gently raised his hand again, and another scene unfolded before me. This time, I was shown the people who had worked for me, my assistants, my drivers, my housekeepers, the countless faces I had never really looked at. I watched myself walking past them, barely nodding, sometimes barking commands. One woman, a single mother of 3, cried herself to sleep night after I had laid her off without notice just to downsize costs and appease shareholders. I had forgotten her name, but Jesus hadn't. He said to me, "Every face you ignored, every soul you stepped over, I saw them." And I wept. My stomach twisted with a guilt so raw I couldn't look up. I fell to my knees in the realm of light, but it wasn't a physical collapse. It was my soul breaking under the weight of love and truth. Then came something even harder to watch. I saw my own children, birthdays I had missed, tears they cried over my absences, their mother trying to hold the family together while I chased another 0 on the end of my net worth. My son had drawn a picture of us once, him holding my hand, but I had tossed it in the trash without even looking. That image was now being shown to me in vivid detail, and I wept uncontrollably. Jesus knelt beside me. He didn't shame me. He didn't scold. He placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "You were made for so much more than money, Jonathan. You were made for love." I felt something crack open in me. It was like a wall that had been built up over decades, brick by brick, with every deal, every transaction, every betrayal I justified in the name of growth. And now that wall was crumbling. I suddenly remembered my mother's voice when I was a child, praying for me. I remember the Bible she used to read in the kitchen, the verses about the love of God and the dangers of serving two masters. I had rolled my eyes back then. Now, those same verses echoed in this holy realm. Then Jesus showed me a vision not of the past, but of what could be my future. If I chose to return, he said, I could be part of something greater. I would not be rich in dollars, but I would be rich in eternity. He showed me moments of joy, hugging my son for the first time in years, reconciling with my daughter at her wedding, feeding the poor, sharing laughter in a modest home filled with love instead of luxury. I saw myself speaking not at board meetings, but in shelters, churches, and schools, telling others what money had done to me and what grace had done to save me. I sobbed and asked, "Why me, Lord? Why would you give me another chance?" He answered, "Because my mercy is greater than your mistakes. But now you must choose." The light began to dim, not in a frightening way, but as if the vision was slowly closing. I felt myself being pulled backward, the sound of beeping machines and panicked voices growing louder. I turned toward Jesus one last time and said, "I choose love." And then, just like that, I was back in my body. Nurses were shouting. Someone screamed that they had a pulse. I gasped, and the room spun wildly as consciousness rushed in. But my heart wasn't the same. Something inside me had shifted forever. When I woke up in the hospital bed, the sterile scent of disinfectant hit me like a splash of cold water. Machines beeped rhythmically beside me, tracking the heartbeat that, only hours earlier, had gone silent for 23 minutes. A nurse gasped when she saw my eyes open. Doctors rushed in like a flood, voices blurring into one another. But I couldn't hear them, not really. I was too busy trying to process what had just happened. I had met Jesus, not just seen him, but stood before him, stripped bare of everything I had ever clung to. And I had come back different. I didn't tell anyone right away. How could I? Who would believe that the Jonathan Vail they knew, the hard-nosed titan of Wall Street, the master of mergers, the man who once laughed at churchgoers, was now convinced that the most valuable asset in life was love? But something inside me had shifted beyond recognition. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't hungry for more. I just wanted to be free. The first sign of that came when I told my legal team to begin liquidating my assets. Stocks, real estate, companies. I wanted it all sold off. Every account, every shell company, every penny I had stacked over 3 decades. They thought I'd lost my mind. One of them even called a psychiatrist, thinking perhaps the trauma had damaged me permanently. But I knew exactly what I was doing. That same week, I reached out to my son, Nathan. We hadn't spoken in 4 years. Not since he told me he was dropping out of law school to pursue music, and I told him he was an embarrassment to the family. My voice trembled when I called. I didn't expect him to answer, but he did. I didn't even get through half my apology before he started sobbing. "Dad," he said, "I prayed every day you'd come back to us. We met for dinner, just the 2 of us. It was awkward at first. Decades of absence can't be filled in one night. But I told him everything. About the heart attack, about Jesus, about how I saw the real damage my ambition had caused. He cried. I cried. And we started again. I wrote a letter to my ex-wife, Maria. I had left her when our marriage got too inconvenient, when the demands of empire outweighed the needs of intimacy. I begged her forgiveness, not just for leaving, but for abandoning the woman who had once loved me when I had nothing. She didn't respond at first, but a week later, she showed up at my door. No words, just a long, silent hug. That hug healed something in me I didn't know was still bleeding. Then I turned to the world. The private jet was sold first. Then the penthouse. I moved into a modest apartment in Queens. No servants, no drivers, just me and a small room with a cross on the wall. I founded a charity called Second Ledger, named after the idea Jesus had given me, storing up treasure in heaven. We began funding hospitals, debt forgiveness programs, prison ministry efforts, and addiction recovery homes. But I didn't just send checks. I showed up. I shook hands with recovering addicts. I sat with the terminally ill. I prayed with broken families. I started attending a small church downtown. Nobody there cared who I had once been. To them, I was just Jonathan, the quiet man in the back pew who wept every time the choir sang Amazing Grace. And every tear that fell was another piece of the old Jonathan crumbling to dust. I was no longer haunted by the scoreboard of net worth. I was driven by something far more precious, redemption. Every meal shared with a stranger, every apology whispered to someone I'd hurt, every hand I held in prayer felt like another jewel stored in a place no market crash could touch. Of course, not everyone understood. Some of my old business partners called me a fraud. The media ran pieces calling it a publicity stunt. One headline read, "From billionaire to bleeding heart, Vale's midlife meltdown." But it didn't matter. I wasn't living for their praise anymore. The strangest part was the peace. For a man who once lived by the tick of the stock market, I now measured time in moments of kindness. I woke up each day asking God to send me someone to love, someone to serve. And He always did. But the greatest transformation wasn't public. It wasn't the headlines or the handouts. It was the quiet restoration of my soul. The parts of me that had grown cold, selfish, and blind were being gently remade, day by grace. Even my body, still frail from the cardiac arrest, felt lighter, like the weight of greed and guilt had lifted from my chest. I breathed easier, not because I had a second chance at life, but because I finally knew what life was for. When I awoke the next morning, I found myself in my own home again, no longer in that sterile, echoing hospital room. But I was not the same man. I stood in front of the mirror, not to check my appearance, but to see if the man Jesus had loved and confronted so intimately was still there in my eyes. And something had changed. I looked older, yes, but also softer. The pride that used to radiate from my posture, my clothes, my grooming, it was replaced by something else. Humility, maybe even hunger. A hunger for real life, for truth. I walked barefoot into my penthouse living room, the massive windows framing the Manhattan skyline. But instead of feeling like a king over an empire, I felt more like a servant in a borrowed palace. None of it was mine anymore, not in the way that mattered. It was just glass, steel, and vanity. I sank onto the couch, wrapped in silence, and said my first real prayer in decades. Jesus, I'm ready. Tell me what to do next. The days that followed were both liberating and terrifying. I called my financial advisors. I called the foundations. I called my assistant. I canceled deals, liquidated investments, and began selling off the properties I once treated like trophies. "What are you doing?" one of my partners asked. "This is financial suicide." But I wasn't committing financial suicide. I was finally letting my soul live. I didn't tell anyone at first about my near-death experience. I didn't want this transformation to be seen as the result of trauma. I wanted the fruit of my new life to speak for itself. So I visited my daughter in Boston. I stood on her front porch for nearly 20 minutes before I found the courage to knock. She opened the door, shocked, uncertain, her little boy peeking from behind her leg. "Dad," she said, and I wept. I collapsed to my knees and held her ankles like I was drowning. "I saw what I've done," I told her. "I saw what I lost. I can never undo it, but if you'll let me, I want to love you now. I want to be your father again." That night we sat on the couch and talked for hours about everything and nothing. She told me about her job at the nonprofit, how she struggled to forgive me but never stopped hoping I'd come back. Her son, Ben, sat in my lap and fell asleep while I told him the story of a man who had everything but forgot what mattered most, until Jesus reminded him. I began using the remaining money not to build new towers or start new ventures, but to repair what I had broken. I paid off the debt of hundreds of single mothers. I anonymously donated to programs helping foster kids. I met with pastors, social workers, and former employees I had once stepped on like rungs in a ladder. I asked for forgiveness. Some gave it. Some didn't, but it didn't matter. I wasn't doing this for reputation. I was doing it because my soul ached to make things right. One day I stood outside a soup kitchen my foundation used to ignore. I introduced myself to the volunteers and asked if they needed help. When they found out who I was, they assumed I was filming some publicity stunt. But I wasn't. I just wanted to serve. I washed dishes in the back, listened to stories from the homeless, and realized how many of them were once just like me, driven, talented, lost. The man I used to be would have viewed that day as wasted hours. But to me it was sacred. It was the first time I truly saw the face of Jesus in others. Not in cathedrals, not in paintings, but in the eyes of the broken and the brave. Later that month, I was invited to speak at a private conference for billionaires and CEOs, an elite group I once longed to impress. When I stood at the podium, I told them everything. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told them about the vault of gold, the moments I missed with my children, the agony of dying with everything yet having nothing. I told them how Jesus looked at me, not with condemnation, but with heartbreak, and said, "Jonathan, this is not why you were created." I looked at those men and women, some of them sneering, others crying, and said, "You don't have to wait until your heart stops to realize what really matters. You can live differently now. You can start today." One of them stood up and left. Another came up to me afterward and asked to pray. You never know what seeds God is planting through your scars. I had become a rich man in a different way, rich in love and freedom and grace. I started seeing every sunrise as a gift. I took my grandson fishing. I walked the streets of my city not as its conqueror, but as its servant. And yet, I knew my journey wasn't over. Jesus didn't just save me to enjoy the rest of my life. He saved me to warn others, to lead others, and to call others out of the bondage of wealth and into the light of eternal purpose. And I was ready. When I opened my eyes in that hospital room, I didn't cry tears of pain or fear. I cried tears of joy. They told me I'd been dead for 23 minutes, and yet somehow I'd returned, fully conscious, fully alive, but not the man I had been before. Something inside me had changed. The bitterness in my bones, the pride in my chest, the endless anxiety wrapped around my wealth, all of it had dissolved in that divine light. And in its place was a stillness, a humility I had never known, and a fire to live differently, to live truly. The first person I asked to see wasn't my doctor. It wasn't my lawyer or financial advisor. It was my son, Caleb. When he entered the room, he looked hesitant, like I might throw blame or act as I always had, distant, cold, uninterested. But I didn't. I simply broke down. I grabbed his hand and wept into it. "I'm sorry," I whispered again and again like a chant. "I missed everything, but if you'll let me, I want to start again." He stood in silence, and then, slowly, he wrapped his arms around me. It was the first time in 2 decades I had felt my son's embrace. In the weeks that followed, I began the hardest journey of all, rebuilding what my money had destroyed. I contacted every one of my ex-employees whom I'd once overworked or discarded. I wrote letters to family members I hadn't spoken to in years. I even reached out to the woman who once loved me but left when she realized I'd chosen gold over grace. I didn't ask for anything from them. I only asked to listen, to hear what my greed had done to others. And with every story I heard, I laid another brick on the road back to being human. But Jesus had told me more than just to repent. He gave me a mission. I sold off the company. I auctioned the penthouse. I gave away every last luxury that once defined me: watches, sports cars, private jets. I donated to orphanages, hospitals, and addiction centers. Not through a foundation, not as a tax write-off, but in person, anonymously, directly. I sat in the same soup kitchens where I now served. I looked in the eyes of the broken and saw in them the same loneliness I once wore behind my $1,000 suit. And then I did something I never thought I'd do. I started speaking, not in boardrooms, but in churches, prisons, recovery homes. I stood on small stages in front of hurting people and told them the truth, that money is a tool, not a god, that wealth will never hold your soul together, that you could have everything and still be dying inside, but also that no one is beyond redemption, that Jesus offers grace, not because we earn it, but because we need it. I kept one small thing from my past life, a journal. I filled it with names, stories, prayers. On the last page, I wrote what Jesus had told me when he showed me the destruction my life had caused. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That verse, Matthew 6, verse 21, was no longer a distant scripture. It was my reality. I had once buried my heart in gold, but now I buried it in love and truth and eternity. Today, I live in a modest 2-bedroom home near the edge of the city. It's quiet here. No assistants. No flashing lights. Just birds in the morning and my grandchildren's laughter on weekends. I bake bread with my daughter. I counsel young men who think power will heal their father wounds. I volunteer at a halfway house downtown. But the most powerful thing I do, I tell people the truth. I tell them that I died and met Jesus, that he showed me what money does to your soul when you worship it, that he brought me back not to condemn, but to awaken. And now I pass that truth to you, because if you're reading this, you still have time. Time to let go, time to forgive, time to choose a different treasure, time to come home. Are you chasing wealth or walking with Jesus? Comment below with how this story impacted you and if you feel called to live differently. Let's start a conversation of transformation right now.